terminological question with this performative speech. And Geronimo, as a often used by the U.S. military, jumping out of parachutes, jumping out of parachutes, the use of the turbine goes back to the 19th century. And the other motto of the SEALs, that is, that's not the motto of the SEAls, it's the attack of the SEAls, is pro ars et focus, for heart and hope, which stands for Horus, that is for God and country. And those are both performative speech acts, I guess. But I wonder if one can take it further and use the term, or dare to use the term, to analyze the very intricate semiotic arrangement of choruses. And I don't mean to get into any kind of formal analysis, it's the power of the economic system, much more important. But it is important. I'm trying to understand how we use performance speech.
I think that I know that that's the history of the use of the term Geronimo, like when you're jumping out of a plane. So, but
it's of course, the kind of Roman, it's ripping and using as an attack against one.
right. So you can read it as a kind of playing Indian and dolorous sense, right? When you say like they're Geronimo, they're jumping out of the plane. But I'm actually suggesting that using Geronimo at that moment to kill Osama bin Laden is a speech act that actually constructs the Muslim terrorists as Native Americans.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So that's I mean how I mean a performative speech act, and that the iteration of it makes the connection in the mind of those that are executing the crime, those that are hearing about the crime, and certainly
with the intricate arrangement of the corpses and the people who assassinate is also a form.
Oh, absolutely.
Of speech.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are codes that are meant to be read, right? I mean, every night, you know, the knifing of villagers, the punishment often fits the crime. Like if somebody's hands are cut off, it's because they stole, you know, some part of the profit of the drug cartel. You know, as we all know, these are, you know, if your tongue is cut out, you know, you've somehow spilled the beans, or, you know, yeah. But I wanted to take us back to that moment of 19th century statecraft when, you know, Mexico actually, or the northern states of Mexico, not all of Mexico, because the central government is actually quite opposed to it, but has no power over the northern states. You know, the fact that these laws exist on the books for 50 years, and, you know, what's paid for the scalps and the heads are, you know, anywhere from 50 pesos to, you know, 3,000 pesos, depending on whether it's a lowly Apache, if it's a leader of the Apache or the Comanche, then you get the 3,000 pesetas, and the scalps are read, right? They read the way in which, you know, because Comanche and Apache is shaved and tattooed their heads in specific ways and more specific regalia. So there's the commissions that are set up to read the scalps, right?
And as I'm sure you know, the history of torture and the semiotics of torture is a very old tradition.
Yes, of course.
And again, not to be a formalist, but there's also, when you think of Bataille's analysis of death by frozen cuts, there's a powerful erotic fascination with such images.
Yes, I mean, yes, I would assume so, because, you know, there's so many of them, and, you know, they're recording their act in perpetuity by taking these photos and uploading them, you know. Actually, merciful, yeah, I'm sorry, I might not be understanding how you want me to read the bodies.
I'm throwing out an idea. Yeah.
No.
Looking at the pictures, I mean, some pictures like Fernando Pinto, like sort of like this sort of what they, in a way, they call it like narco-periodismo, like, and how they, in a way, have attempted to do a performance or like a setting of, even like for example, Fernando Pinto's work, present a dead body in a kind of like in a peaceful sort of like scenery, and how kind of like make it as if like we are not portraying exactly how those bodies or members were left. How do we make sense of those sort of like theatralizations of torture within this framework, like the idea about I don't know if you could, you know, I'm trying to like think of like theatralization of this torture, and how can we play those in this sort of discourse, if you think?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of photos. They're very, I mean, this is disturbing, and fortunately, actually, because these are all anonymous photos, I couldn't use the images in the coda. You unfortunately get to see them because I don't need high quality resolution and I don't need permission. But I actually wasn't able to use the images in the coda because of that. But many of them are very witty. I mean, like the head sleeping on the top of the, you know, the cetas, this is for sleeping, you know, or in one they're like, you know, they have sombreros, and, you know, they're racializing themselves as, you know, as indio barbaros, you know, I mean, they are participating themselves in that kind of like, you know, interpretation of what they do, right? Like, I mean, they're beating up against each other, they have a bottle of tequila, they're completely, you know, scalped. I mean, they're just the skull, you know, so that, and the hat, and I mean, as we see in, you remember in Infierno, I don't know if anyone saw El Infierno, but, you know, they take great joy in setting up the body. So, I mean, I think it's important that it's meant to entertain, right? It's meant to entertain the spectators, either because it's so horrific, or because it's witty, or because, you know, it actually somehow speaks, you know, speaks these stereotypes of themselves, or, you know, speaks their own, you know, kind of fascination with ritual, right? I mean, I think it is very important for establishing a power that's not just military, but actually symbolic, right? And I think that to do that, you do have to have a lot of theatricality, right? Because the scene has to convey, not just I killed this person, you know, but like the scene of them sitting in a half circle. I mean, I looked at it there's a scene from a picture, you know, they look like they're just having a chat, if not for the fact that, you know, they're killed, you know, but they're kind of sitting in a, you know, just kind of, we're hanging out, you know, after plastic chairs, you know. I mean, there is a way in which it's not just their military power, but their, you know, symbolic and semiotic power that they're very much enunciating. You know, and I think the fact that they absolutely, the fact that you can't find the bodies of the Ayotzinapa victims also shows the limit of that symbology, right? That symbolism, right? Because you can't do that to icons of the revolution, right? Because those normales were established after, you know, by the revolutionary government. So I think that you have to completely decimate any evidence that you killed them, because to have done anything with their bodies would have really been a desecration that might go too far, right? Of the history of Mexico's past revolutionary action. You know, because they're Robin Hoods. It's like, I can't tell you, they are Robin Hoods, and I can't tell you how many people in New York City are like, ay, capturaron al Chapo, era tan bueno, ay, hizo tantas cosas por su gente. Or, you know, you hear his wife on television, you're like, es muy galán. And, you know, he made her finish high school and go to college. I mean, it's like, you know, es muy galán. You know what I mean? You're like, it's this, you know, in their own way, they're also capitalizing on, you know, Mexican revolutionary iconography, which was very violent. You know, Mexican Revolution, 1 million people died. So but again, I don't want to make it like it's the history of violent Mexico. I think that, you know, this, it's very easy to fall into a reading of them as, you know, a kind of a racialized reading of what they're doing. And it's not that it's not embodied. I mean, obviously this is really embodied violence, but it's the product of a particular conjuncture, you know, an economic conjuncture. And that's why I do think, like, we keep calling Donald Trump a racist, but like after his racist comments, the next biggest thing he says is, I'm going to end all of these trade agreements, right? I'm going to end NAFTA, I'm going to end the Pacific Accord, you know, and those are things that really, because I could have made the same talk about the devastation of NAFTA from the perspective of the U.S. economy, but I don't work really on the U.S., you know, so I didn't, you know, but you could have made the same kind of, because it didn't, it's not like it bolstered the U.S. industry or working class or, you know, it bolstered U.S. agro industry.
So I don't want to dwell much longer on these very striking images, but viewing them, I felt that they look very similar to sort of the images you get in the Algerian War of Independence, or for that matter, even from the period of brigandage, which we discussed this morning. I mean, you also have decapitations, the display of the bodies of brigands or insurgents in public spaces, and it's very striking how similar these are, and how similar also the sort of kind of display that is being put on with these bodies is. And I thought that your comment is sort of that we should maybe look at these displays as symbols of statecraft might be interesting. It seems like it's a very sort of universal method of displaying.
Well, that's why I'm like, you know, I mean, I'm giving this talk for Here Ideas South, but it really is a talk that I think you can put under the coloniality of power, right? Because it's precisely the coloniality of statecraft. Because indeed, and this morning when you were talking, I was like, oh, this is a perfect example of how the racialization of the Indio, either as bárbaro or as loyal convert, right? As infidel or as, you know, faithful Indian, right? Both of those are this kind of production of the transnational, you know, the transatlantic movement of ideas about, you know, limpieza de sangre, as María Elena Martinez has so beautifully written in her book, Genealogical Fictions, right? Limpieza de sangre, which brought ideas of the impurity of Jews, conversos, moriscos, to the U.S., you know, configured, I mean, to Latin America, to the Americas, and configured this new, you know, not religious, you know, becoming race of the castas, right? Pureza de sangre. But, you know, the castas have moriscos as one of the castas. So when you said, like, the cannibalism of that was implied upon them, cannibalism, if you hear cannibalism, I hear, well, this is precisely about the, you know, colonial making race, right? The colonial project of making race out of these presumed acts of barbarism, right? That you said, you know, it comes from Africa, but it comes from Africa through, you know, the Caribbean and Spain, you know, and Peru.
So what I thought was interesting is that, I mean, I guess in most cases we don't have images of the barbarism of the supposed cannibalism. We do have these pictures of the state-inflicted barbarities. So maybe that's something to think about. It's the actual images we get from the phenomenon of brigandage, or what we know from the Algerian War of Independence is the brutality of the state, and the brutality of the insurgents. It's almost like the brutality of the state is supposed to cancel the acts, even though it's I don't know, it's very paradoxical in trying to battle with it.
Well, I mean, these are, I mean, the figures are there's the division between cartel and military is very blurred, but, you know, these are the brigands, right, of the northern territories, right, of northern Mexico, because it is impactful that this actually stops. Not that cartel killings stop, but this kind of expressive killing stops once you get to central Mexico, right? I mean, reiterating that kind of chichimecas as the, you know, those the northerners that not even the Aztecs thought were worthy of killing, right? You know, so it does bring all of that back. But yeah, I don't know what it means that these aren't. I think that it brings up ideas of cannibalism and of idolatry, you know, with Santa Muerte. But I think that's like precisely where the coloniality of power takes us, but where we should actually try not to go. You know what I mean? Because these aren't, I think that we need to pay heed to the peace movement that insists on negotiating with these people, right? Because to not negotiate is to just say that we're going to somehow excise from the Mexican nation, you know, millions of economic actors, right? Or I don't know if they're millions or hundreds of thousands, but you know, it's the cadre, the cartels are tens of thousands, but it's a number, you know, are we going to do that again? Are we going to excise the Apache, the Comanche, the Siri, the Kiowa, the, you know, the Yaqui, are we going to go through that again? Is Mexico going to do that again? Or is it going to sit down and negotiate peace and reestablish the centralized organization of the plazas? Because, I mean, might be boring, but I'll tell you anyway. You know, when the PRI loses, I mean, there is a certain line of analysis of what happens, that when the PRI loses to the PAN, the PRI controlled the military, and the military resolved disputes of the plazas among the cartels, right? So it's kind of bajaron línea, and the army would negotiate among the cartels. There were only 11 at that time. Now there are, you know, many, many more. And so when the PRI leaves, the PAN doesn't have that relationship with the army, and that's the moment. And then not only that, but Calderon comes and enlists the army to fight the cartels, and that's the moment where the army and the cartels form this kind of unholy alliance, and all fucking hell breaks loose, right? And you know, there is no country on earth who could afford to pay their police or military the equivalent of what the cartels pay these people. I mean, you know what I mean? It's not just, you always hear, they're paid so badly. I'm like, yeah, they're paid badly, but dude, you know, if somebody came up to you and said, take $10,000 this month or I'll kill you, you're gonna take the $10,000, you know what I mean? Like, Mexican salaries, the thing that I trip on about the story of the 72 South Americans who were killed is the $400 a week. Like, just think about it. What undocumented immigrant is going to make $400 a week in the United States? You know what I mean? It's like, that's actually a phenomenal amount of money, you know, especially in Mexico, right, where these people are presumably going to live. I mean, I know that's a weird thing to trip over, but I do think, wow, you know, that's what they're paying their low-level distributors.
Thank you so much for your fascinating talk. I was especially delighted that you chose decolonial studies as your framework. It's mine. You did a lot of definitional work for me, so I'm presenting tomorrow morning. And I am really interested in the figure of the Indio Barbaro, like in U.S. and Mexican statecraft. And I was just wondering, like, how does gender come in? Like, you mentioned like the coloniality of power and Marquiano, but like, what about, like, do you engage with like Maria Lugones and like the coloniality of gender? Like, is there like an India Barbara? And like, how does like racialized gender come into play here?
I don't. I mean, it is it is the figure that I work with is a masculine figure. That's why I use the pronoun he, which which I actually footnote in the book and say I'm using he because when you say Indio Barbaro, you're talking about, and the way in which their barbarity is often established in the historiography is, as per usual, how they treat their women. So there is that gendering of the kind of like the European imposition of what proper gender relations would be with the Indio Barbaro. But I do not really engage with the coloniality of gender as I should. I imagine it would be there to be read implicitly, but I mean, a lot of the captives also are women. The captives that are transported by the Apache, that are forms of exchange between the Apache and the Pueblo, the Comanche and the Pueblo, so there is a lot of gender, dynamics, but I don't, unfortunately, analyze them.
Go for it now.
again, in genuine, sincere solidarity with your talk. What I found, and I don't know what word to use, I was going to say disturbing or curious about your talk, was the moment when you told us to shut our eyes, and you made the reference to the
Game of Thrones.
On the throne. So why wouldn't it have been better not to have said that? Why are we supposed to avert our eyes?
No, actually, I describe because it is from the coda, and so as you can see, I had to describe everything.
But why shouldn't we see that?
Because I don't think that everyone, I'm not a fan of trigger warnings, but I do think this is a trigger warning, especially, it's just a degree of mutilation that, as you said, it's like, when you think of the dirty wars and the counterinsurgency wars in Central America, there was always a body left. You know what I mean? There were a few bodies left in plazas, in ditches, but we don't actually, we have to reconstruct from the truth commissions what happened to these people. And it's devastating, and I'm not saying we don't need to take responsibility and reform drug policy and end the drug war, but I don't know that we need to see the pictures. Those things live in your mind. Having to do this research for the coda was really just awful.
I profoundly disagree with
Well,
you.
why? No, that's good. Well, no, tell me why. No, I welcome disagreement. Why? Tell me. And then I won't tell people to look away. Because, I have given this talk before, and a person whose family member had been killed by the narcos was like, I really wish you would have. And I'm like, you also don't know who you're speaking to. But anyway, why would you not tell people to look away?
I just don't like censorship.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, you can always look them up on the web. No one's stopping you from looking them up on the web.
I was really interested, I was kind of randomly listening to just a little bit of French TV the other day, and the Mexican ambassador to France was speaking about how people think, oh, there's all these people leaving Mexico, but in fact, he said, people are coming to Mexico. I found that to be so bizarre as this kind of like, piece of, kind of diplomatic conversational piece about, oh, well, when we go to Europe, we want to explain to them that, people are coming back to Mexico or whatever. So I was curious if you had something to say about that, because it seemed like you had a lot of the kind of statistical, information that was really interesting. And then I was curious too about this question of deindustrialization and your framework of deindustrialization as feudalism. So I'm wondering, and I really appreciated the piece about the debate, in terms of like multiple modes of production existing simultaneously. I think that's really essential and correct, actually, I agree, absolutely. But I'm interested if specifically the feudal mode of production requires what you called labor compulsion, and precisely, you talked about the violence of labor compulsion, like you have to do this or you're killed and that kind of stuff. I'm just wondering if there's are there any other features that, because I think that deindustrialization itself serves as, an understanding of perhaps not a move, spatial metaphors are bad for this because but a move toward feudalism, if you will. But I'm wondering if there were more specifics about that choice.
Well, I do think that it is a form of, especially in the context of New Spain, I do think there's a resemblance. Again, just, with every analogy, there's also things that are not, that are distinguish it, but there is a resemblance to, the encomienda, for example, as a kind of, again, I think it's really important to remember what Klaus said. This was not feudalism, this was a different model of, coercion, of extra economic coercion that, that was not like serfdom but something new, right? And so that's why I'm like feudalistic future and feudal light, but not feudal, because there are these extra economic modes of coercion, be they, you know, you now have to produce poppy and marijuana where you might have produced corn, that at the point of the gun, or because, well, actually, you don't actually have, well, you're not gonna make any money producing sorghum or corn or soy or any of the things that you might have produced previously. So, I mean, that's what I mean by, you know, extra economic forms of coercion, you know, that might come into play.
And then the thing about immigration.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, I think that is like, that's so Mexican, because it's like, yeah, Obama deported 1.2 million immigrants, I guess that's their coming back. I mean, there probably are people who are self-deporting. I mean, you know, there probably are people who are self-deporting, both because of the lack of jobs, you know, the drying up of jobs, although I don't see any drying up of jobs for undocumented workers in New York City, but perhaps in other places, right? You know, construction's booming, service economy is booming. So I would imagine that he's really playing with figures, because it is true, for example, that South Americans come to Mexico to work because Mexico's economy,
Right.
thanks to this drug money, is much healthier. You know, as anyone who goes to Mexico City knows, you know, you'll encounter a lot of South Americans, you'll encounter Europeans, you know, and you're like, dude, what are you doing here? And they're like, oh, well, you know, we're doing this, we're doing that. There's always a new restaurant, like, you know, tapa, Mexican, Spanish tapa, or whatever, you know, always opening up. And so I do think there is, and then of course, again, like really, really, you know, sardonically, there are the immigrants from Central America who are coming to Mexico in droves, but to get to the U.S.
Right.
So I have a comment and a question. I think that the Indio Barbaro is a really rich concept for thinking about colonial Philippines, which is something that I work on, which, as you know, was part of New Spain.
Yes, yes.
And the indigenous people there were called Indios, and then later thinking about U.S. colonization of the Philippines. And so I'm losing my train of thought. Let me go to check backwards. So this figure in the Philippines is a particularly interesting geopolitical space that's at once considered west and then considered east by the 19th century. So I wanted to go back to this thing that you mentioned very briefly in your talk, which is that southeast intersection that you're looking at with the Indio. And I wondered if you could say more about how else that informs your thinking.
Well, it does inform my thinking quite a bit in the first half of the book, because in the first half of the book, before liberalism, before independence, I'm looking at the way in which the Indian is inscribed as potential convert. And so what I argue in the book is that it's not until liberalism, it's not until nationalism, that you actually get the solidification of an Indio Barbaro, like the reification of the Indio Barbaro, right? Prior to that, Indios are always, I mean, what makes them so useful for Mexican colonial mission is that they're always morphing. You know, they could be faithful, they may be apostate, they may betray you, they may come back and love you. I mean, there's this real like dance, especially in the in the northern frontier, which is, you know, the area that I look at. You know, those are my archives, my case studies, right, in the 17th and 18th century. So that the figure of the infidel is so much of it is borrowed from, you know, from Islam. And actually, you know, earlier today, the nationalization of territory, subsoil, is taken from Islamic law, right? Like it belongs to the community. And so the whole community, not just the people who live on it. So much of what informs the Indio Barbaro are these Eastern Orientalist ideas of what a faithful Indian can and should be, and what, you know, and what a faithful and what an unfaithful Indian is and could be, right? And so that there's always I argue that the Spaniards really need the possibility of betrayal, because that's what keeps the mission alive. And in the Philippines, which I know next to nothing about, but I do know that their colonial mission has to deal with actual Islamic peoples, right? Because the thing about the New World is that it's a utopia because they've never been exposed. That's why Indios have limpieza de sangre, because they were never exposed to heretical Christianity or Judaism or Islam. So they're like, it's like, wow, it's just beautiful, right, for them. It's like perfect. And yet, they import all of these ideas of the infidel onto the Indian in order to understand the Indian, because it's always happening by a process of for the Spaniards, it's like they're seeing similarity everywhere, and they're just mapping it on, they're just like glomming it on to, and some of the similarities they see, and you can see it in the colonial records, they often use very, very Orientalist terms to describe first encounters, and so it's very, very rich in that sense, the colonial archive.
Coming back to the symbology you were telling us about concerning these images of mutilations and killings, you said that this is a way of appropriation of an identity. So these people, these narcos, like they say, we are Indios, barbaros, and so we behave like what we are. Well, probably it's what I was thinking about. It's also a way of controlling a very archaic idea of power. Because if you take, for instance, and you also mentioned it, Discipline and Punish, the first chapter, Discipline and Punish, is entitled the brightness of punishments. And as well, I think another comparison could be made with a movie, the last movie released by Pasolini, Salò. If you consider Salò, it's a story of mutilations and killings. And what lies inside is that the real power, the most powerful power, has no limits. So the real essence of power is to have no limits. And this is the real essence of power, to have no limits. So, I mean, it's like it's like communicating a very archaic and deep idea of power.
Absolutely. And I think it's the kind of power that the Spanish crown brings with it to New Spain, right, and well, to the New World, the power to absolutely, the power to demand absolute submission. And if you submit, all goes well. But as we know, the requerimiento, if you don't submit, we have the right to wage war, inflict the most damage possible, steal your wives, burn your goods. I mean, that's in the requerimiento. That's what they read to the Indians. And so it's like, either you submit, or we absolutely abject you in that submission. It's submission either way, but if you submit peacefully, you get to keep all that, which in fact they did allow them to do. Or if you don't submit, it's absolute abjection and submission. And I mean, I think in Cruel Modernity, Jean Franco's Cruel Modernity, I always joke that it should be called Cruel Coloniality, right? Because what the dirty wars, that's another place where they have no limit. Like the dirty wars in the Southern Cone, the counterinsurgency wars in Guatemala and Peru and El Salvador, these are places where they have absolutely no limit. And reading Jean's book really made me think, well, what's the submission that they're after? They're after submission to a particular model of capital dominion, right? Of capitalist dominion, right? That demands subjugation. And when we were in the middle of the dirty wars, like, I think that everyone was so overwhelmed, but it is meant to actually give you, to paralyze you, right? And I think what it kept people who were in the midst of all that, through that 50-year period, kept us, everyone thought it was about like capitalism versus communism, but on another level, it was like, absolutely not. You must have absolute submission to our model of capitalist dominion. And as I said in the morning, now you have leftist governments, which I understand are truly leftist, from a certain perspective. But what it means to be left has absolute, means that you do submit to the market, and then you try to do a little bit better distribution.
Which is why Pasolini considered Salo an allegory of what he called neo-capitalism.
Made it to 6. We can continue discussing this in the other room.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really funny that you say Saldan, because Saldan is one of those films that I started seeing in the